Welcome back to the table, friends. I'm your humble host, GreyDM. With me, as always, is Owen.
Hi there.
In our long string of Owen teaching us things that are very interesting,
Hopefully you guys find it interesting.
we're going to dive into a topic today led by Owen. I heard there's some troubling news about the kids in the tunnels these days.
Yeah, those kids, who think about the children?
So take it away, Owen. What exactly are we diving in today?
So in my last speaking role, I talked a bit about LARPing, and some people found that interesting, some people didn't. But one of the topics that came up in that was a thing called the Satanic Panic. And Grey and myself being of a certain age, we existed during this time, but I don't think we weren't experiencing it. We weren't in that group yet. Well, you grew up in a different place than I did, so it might have been bigger.
I got the residuals.
Yeah,
in a different context.
Like, you were part of the youth group. I was not.
I got taken into a room and watched a VHS that was sponsored by my buddy's church called Hell's Bells and the Secret Satanic Messages, broadcasted by Metal.
Oh, okay, gotcha. You got the heavy metal music version.
And the dude who was making us, like, the dude who was watching us, who's having us watch it in protest with the new youth pastor, was a dude who was in a band and had a mohawk. And he was like, this is bullshit. And then they got to this point, I remember it vividly, because they got to this point where they were like, and then the band, see, they knew that could get into your minds and sell you to the devil, so they called themselves Cheap Trick. And he just stops it in front of everybody, and he's like, no, there's a series of clubs in, like, Cincinnati, and every band is allowed to go through them once. And this band kept renaming themselves every time they go through them. And the last time they did it before they became famous, they named themselves Cheap Trick. He's like, I hate this woman. What's her name? Gore? What's her name? Tipper Gore?
Oh, Tipper Gore,
He's like, fuck Tipper Gore. Yeah, fuck this video. And we're all like, yeah, we're with that guy.
Yeah, she's the whole reason that we have video game ratings and music ratings and parental advisories on things. And
it's like I said, that was like the aftershock of this. Like, it was just that period of outrage for everything.
Yeah. I'm mainly going to be talking about it in the gaming community, but yes, I do talk about a few of the other things that come up. But yeah, so we're going to start with this in the 70s, where all interesting things seem to start, at least with a lot of the topics that we talk about. So in the 70s, popular media like The Exorcist had convinced a portion of the public that demonic forces were real. And high-profile climbs by cult leaders like Charles Manson stoked anxieties about the occult. In the atmosphere, a new type of game emerged. Dungeons & Dragons debuted in 1974, inviting players to imagine fantasy worlds of monsters and magic. At first, D&D was a nice hobby enjoyed by wargamers and fantasy enthusiasts. But as the game's popularity grew through the late 70s, it began to draw the attention and suspicions of those already primed to see Satan lurking in the shadows of pop culture. By the end of the decade, the stage was set for the Satanic Panic that would bizarrely entangle dice and dungeon maps with devils and darkness. Like that alliteration?
Very nice.
Yeah, I did that special. So, the spark that ignited the panic occurred in August 1979. This is something that we talked about in the LARPing podcast. James Dallas Egbert III, a 16-year-old prodigy at Michigan State University, vanished from the campus. A private investigator hired by his family learned that Egbert enjoyed D&D and speculated to the press that perhaps Egbert had gotten lost in the university's steam tunnels during a real-life enactment of his fantasy game. Sensational news reports ran with this theory, portraying D&D as a possible cause of the disappearance. In reality, Egbert had been struggling with clinical depression, pressure, and drug use, and had retreated into the tunnels in a suicide attempt completely unrelated to gaming. He was eventually found alive, but tragically died by suicide a year later. Though false, the dramatic steam tunnel story became an enduring urban legend associated with D&D. Media hype around Egbert's case marked the first time the game was cast as a sinister influence in the public eye. Ironically, all the publicity only made D&D more popular. Sales of the D&D basic set skyrocketed after the so-called steam tunnel incident, jumping from about 5,000 copies per month to over 30,000 by the end of 1979. Nonetheless, the idea that Dungeons and Dragons could blur the line between reality and fantasy, even drive someone into danger, had entered the cultural consciousness. So, in the early 1980s, fictionalized accounts further fanned the flames of paranoia. In 1981, author Rana Jaffe published Mazes and Monsters, a novel loosely inspired by the Egbert case. The story portrayed a college student's descent into delusion and tragedy through playing a D&D-like game. It was pure sensationalism, but it struck a nerve. The book was quickly adapted into a made-for-TV movie, also called Mazes and Monsters, in 1982, and this starred a young Tom Hanks as the gamer-turned-insane protagonist. Millions of viewers saw this cautionary tale of a role-playing game leading to mental breakdown. Around the same time, a low-budget Canadian horror film called Skullduggery, made in 1983, depicted a D&D-style game as a tool of the devil that transforms a man into a killer. These dramatic depictions reinforce the notion that there was something inherently dangerous about fantasy games. Not all representations were negative. Notably, in 1983, the D&D cartoon series launched on Saturday Morning Network TV, presenting the game as kid-friendly adventure. Yet, even this innocent cartoon disturbed some conservative audiences. Their critics, already wary of occult influences, the sight of children casting spells and fighting demons, even if animated and heavily sanitized, was further evidence that D&D was sneaking pagan ideas into the mainstream. The public was becoming increasingly polarized. Kids and teens embraced D&D's imaginative fun, while a growing number of adults came to see the game as a moral threat. Even before a full-fledged national panic took hold, local controversies over D&D began to erupt. One early flashpoint came in 1980 in the small community of Heber City, Utah. Two school employees started a D&D after-school club, only to meet swift resistance once parents discovered the club's activities. The presence of monsters and devils in D&D manuals alarmed many in this conservative Mormon area. What began as a simple, imaginative outlet for students was soon blown out of proportion amid accusations that the game was the devil's work.
Anyway, it's still such a stretch. All of them they are. But like they're just like, oh no, this is a game where you could be a religious warrior who fights a devil. That must be some satanic cult.
Yeah.
What?
A lot of it just came from you're casting spells.
Yeah.
And they're like, oh, that's a ritual, that's witchcraft, that's, necromancy,
And I think a lot of it came from like, this is going to make me famous.
Yeah. We get into that a little bit.
Okay.
A public school board meeting was called to address the growing outcry. At that 1980 meeting, concerned parents listened as the club leaders and even a representative from D&D's publisher, TSR, tried to explain the game and dispel the fears. In a now legendary anecdote, the TSR representative attempted to demonstrate D&D's harmlessness by facetiously casting a D&D spell in front of the crowd, then pointing out that nothing happened. One enraged woman stood up and retorted, "Of course it didn't work. I'm filled with the Holy Ghost," implying her divine protection prevented the magic. Oh man, I feel sorry for whoever's kids that was. The meeting ended with a compromise. The board allowed the club to continue, but instructed the teachers to remove any rulebooks depicting demons. This victory for D&D was short-lived. Under continued pressure within the year, the school district banned the club outright, caving to the moral panic. Similar stories played out elsewhere as a trickle of school and church bans on D&D presaged the wider storm to come. In 1982, a tragic event gave D&D's opponents their most emotionally charged ammunition. Irving Pulling, a 17-year-old high school student in Virginia, died by suicide on June 9, 1982. Irving had been an active D&D player, and his grieving mother, Patricia Pulling became convinced that the game was to blame for his death. In her anguish, Patricia fixated on a gaming incident shortly before Irving's suicide. Reportedly, a teacher who ran a D&D club had jokingly placed a curse on Irving's character during play. His mother later claimed this imaginary curse had real-world power and drove him to take his life.
No, you're a bad parent.
Yes.
That's what that was.
Well, just wait until Gary Gygax gets into this. Yeah. Pulling sued the school principal for wrongful death, alleging the staff had allowed a D&D curse that harmed her son. She also filed suit against TSR, the publisher of D&D, for instigating dangerous practices. By 1983, both lawsuits had been dismissed. There was no evidence that D&D had caused Irving's death, but Patricia Pulling was not swayed by the court's rejection. Instead, she transformed her personal tragedy into a highly public crusade against role-playing games. After her legal case failed, Patricia Pulling founded a one-woman advocacy group called Bothered About Dungeons and Dragons, or BAD. BAD became the tip of the start.
Is that the start of that chain of acronyms?
Yes.
Oh my God.
Well, I don't know. MAD. I think
Mothers
Against Drinking. Yeah. Well, it's Mothers Against Drunk Driving. MADD. Yeah. It could be. I don't know. I didn't look that far into it.
Go on. Yeah, that's interesting.
So BAD became the tip of the spear in the emerging satanic panic as it related to RPGs. Pulling styled herself as an expert on the occult dangers of gaming, even obtaining a private investigator's license to lend credibility. She wrote and distributed pamphlets full of alarming claims about D&D, often citing out-of-context snippets from rulebooks as evidence of devil worship.
Okay, so So I know. So first of all, I get that this woman was basically half just trying to deal with her grief and half trying to get fame out of this, right? Like, so she's just doing really dumb, crappy things. But also let it be known that if you're ever trying to wage a political war, like especially against something like witchcraft or demon worshiping, the worst thing you could do is tell everybody about it. Like, just straight up, you increase everybody's interest in it by a geometric amount.
Well, a lot of advertisers and promoters have figured that out. When, a new album is coming out or something, there's almost always some kind of, oh my God, the scandal. Don't buy their album. The scandal. And it just drives.
It's like distilled into the nature of 5 things your doctor doesn't want you to know. Like,
absolutely, 100%. So BAD described D&D as a fantasy role-playing game which uses demonology, witchcraft, voodoo, murder, rape, blasphemy, suicide, assassination, insanity, sex perversion, homosexuality, prostitution, satanic-type rituals, gambling, barbarism, cannibalism, sadism, desecration, demon summoning, and necromancy.
Oh, I thought they were going to throw communism in there. Just waiting for and communism. I'm like, oh, okay.
In Pulling's view, D&D wasn't just a game. It was a veritable encyclopedia of immoral and satanic activities. That exhaustive list of horrors was widely ridiculed. D&D players knew their hobby involved no acts of rape, prostitution, or eating babies. And that's a big one. Like eating babies.
Why is eating babies the thing that they always go to? Like, it's been this thing, like, where it's been debunked how many times that, like, there are very, very few instances throughout history of anybody eating babies. But everybody goes to it.
Like, I know. It's the thing. For a lot of them, they imagine that's the worst thing ever. Yeah. Most of the people in the mid-1980s, they took a lot of these claims as, face value. They don't know anything about D&D, and someone from the church is telling them this. So BAD gained surprising traction through both Christian and mainstream media outlets. Imagine that. Fundamentalist Christians, preachers eagerly welcomed Pulling's message that a diabolical threat lurked in kids' closets in the form of polyhedral dice. Church newsletters, radio programs, and community lectures spread the dire warning about D&D.
That part was true. They didn't understand.
No,
it was a financial hit. It was
yeah. Pulling and like-minded collaborators appeared on roughly 30 talk shows and news programs to alert the nation. One ally, Dr. Thomas Radecki, psychiatrist and chair of the National Coalition on TV Violence, became a frequent spokesperson linking D&D to real violence. Radecki would cite grisly statistics claiming the game had inspired 28 murders and suicides by 1985. Though these figures were later shown to be based on essentially nothing, a patchwork of hearsay and unsourced clippings, but at the time they lent bad a veneer of legitimacy. The anti-D&D campaign hit the national spotlight on October 28, 1985, when 60 Minutes aired a segment on the controversy. In that televised piece, host Ed Bradley somberly introduced D&D as a game popular with children, but viewed by some adults as linked to a number of suicides and murders. Patricia Pulling was predominantly featured along with Dr. Radecki and Gary Gygax, co-creator of D&D. The segment presented grieving parents who blamed the game for their sons' deaths, juxtaposed with Gygax's defense of his creation. Under the studio lights, Radecki doubled down on his shocking assertions, telling millions of viewers that Dungeons & Dragons was full of human sacrifice, eating babies, drinking blood, and rape. In his words, a worship of violence. Gygax, visibly frustrated, rebutted these claims in plain terms. This is a make-believe, he explained, likening D&D to Monopoly. Who is bankrupted by a game of Monopoly? Nobody. The money isn't real, he said. He argued there was no link to real crimes except perhaps in the minds of those people who are looking desperately for any other cause than their own failures as a parent.
It's true. It's the sad truth, right?
Yep. Gygax's sharp retort, essentially accusing the panicked parents of scapegoating his game, didn't win him much sympathy on national TV, but he articulated what many actual players felt. The moral panic was being driven by fear and lack of understanding, not facts. Public reaction to the 60 Minutes expose was intense. Concerned parents across the country suddenly wondered if the funny dice game in their basement was a gateway to damnation. Libraries and schools saw pressure to pull D&D materials off the shelves. Some bookstores quietly moved D&D products behind the counter. On the flip side, not everyone was convinced by Bad's narrative. Many parents of D&D players defended the game. One Illinois mother wrote a letter to her newspaper after seeing the 60 Minutes episode, calling the panic ridiculous. She noticed that her own son had played for 8 years with no ill effect. If people don't want their kids playing D&D, don't buy the game. What was that to do with the rest of us? I think all this brouhaha is ridiculous, she said. Still, the loud voices of fear often drowned out the voices of reason. By late 1985, Dungeons & Dragons had been fully swept up in the wider satanic panic, a climate in which wild rumors of satanic cults, ritual abuse, and occult indoctrination of youth were pervasive in America. D&D was now regularly mentioned in the same breath as backmasked rock music, Cheap Trick, heavy metal, and even alleged witchcraft in daycare centers as part of the supposed conspiracy to ensnare kids' soul. Do you remember the whole backmasking where you play it backwards and it says, worship the devil and crap like that?
Lenin is dead or whatever.
Yeah. As the panic peaked, any crime or misfortune involving a young person who even dabbled in D&D risked being attributed to the game. Tragic cases that would normally be seen as isolated incidents of mental illness or violence were folded into the satanic panic narrative if RPG materials were found in the vicinity. This led to a slew of sensational headlines and urban legends in the mid to late 1980s. In 1984, 2 young men in Colorado died in an apparent murder-suicide. Police investigating their deaths openly wondered if D&D was a factor. Incredibly, one police chief speculated to the press that in D&D, once you reach a certain point where you are the master, your only way out is death, implying that a dungeon master might kill himself to win. No such rule or concept exists in D&D, but this quote shows how authorities who didn't understand the game tried to map it onto real violence. This claim was reported in a Night Ridders, a news publication of the time, service article, further spreading the idea that the game was leaving a trail of bodies. Actual analysis later found that Bad's list was massively exaggerated and repetitive. Many of the supposed 51 cases were the same few incidents cited over and over. Nonetheless, the frightening notion that kids are killing themselves over in D&D became a staple of talk shows and church sermons. Fundamentalist tracts and preachers amplified the most extreme stories. In 1984, evangelical cartoonist Jack T. Chick published the comic tract Dark Dungeons, in which a young woman loses her character in a D&D game and consequently attempts suicide, only to be saved by discovering Christianity. The comic's villain is literally a Satan-worshipping dungeon master who uses the game to recruit for a coven, an absurd caricature, yet one that some readers took at face value. The tract even shows the protagonist burning her D&D rule books after she sees the light, a scene that no doubt played out in real life as some youth pastors encouraged game book burnings. In fact, book and record burnings became a phenomenon in the 1980s panic. Some churches held bonfires to destroy D&D and manuals alongside heavy metal albums considered to have demonic influences.
Or convince everybody to melt all their Warhammer so my stock goes up. You know? It seems
We're not making any more of these.
Why can't I get in on this, right? If I get all the Christian moms pissed off at Warhammer and I get enough outrage, can I come out of this with a lot of money? There's more, clearly more in just the visuals of Warhammer miniatures than in all the D&D.
Oh yeah,
because I can just point to Slanesh. I could be literally. Yeah. They have the god of murder. They have the god of sex. They have the god of disease. It's very easy to instill this kind of panic in people.
So yeah, the worst ones are the space wolves. You guys should burn all of your space wolves.
Well, they're turning kids furry. It just plays itself, right? You just keep going. They start hunting, and you're like, "Oh man, that stock price is going up.
Oh god,
my pile of shame's gonna carry me through retirement."
You mean wall of shame? The wall of shame.
Yes. My mountain of shame.
Yes. So in 1986, a Virginia politician even tried to turn the panic into a platform. Winston Matthews, a candidate for state attorney general, campaigned on removing D&D from schools, claiming the game teaches Satan worship, spellcasting, witchcraft, rape, suicide, and assassination. He thankfully lost the election, but the fact that a political campaign latched onto D&D as a menace shows how mainstream the fear had become. That same year, the Richmond Times-Dispatch profiled a local anti-D&D crusader, a housewife named Sharon Sippos, who cast the struggles in spiritual terms. Sippos said she was engaged in a spiritual battle against D&D and even opposed a Christian-themed alternative game called Dragon Raid. In her view, any role-playing, even using Bible verses for spells, was too occult and becomes the player's god, as she said.
But buy my book. Buy my role-playing game.
Yeah. Her zealotry underscored that for the hardest-line opponents, no compromise, not even making the game overtly Christian, was acceptable. Perhaps the most notorious criminal case linked to D&D was a 1988 murder of Leif Van Stein in North Carolina. The case made national headlines when it emerged that a group of college students, including Von Stein's stepson, plotted to kill Von Stein for insurance money and were all D&D players. During the investigation, police found a hand-drawn map of the victim's house among the group's gaming materials, which prosecutors argued was a D&D game map used to plan the murder. The defendants were convicted in 1990, but the media seized on the role-playing angle. True crime books like Blood Games and Cruel Doubt dramatized the story, painting one conspirator as corrupted by his dungeon master persona. When TV movies were made about the case in 1992, producers even doctored the prop D&D manuals on screen to look more satanic. Although the murder clearly had more to do with greed and drug use than games, it became a pop culture example of D&D gone wrong. So there you go, kids. If you're going to plan a murder, don't hide your stuff in your D&D stash. Another figure was Sean Sellers, a 16-year-old from Oklahoma who murdered his parents in 1986. Sellers had dabbled in Satanism and claimed demonic possession as a defense. Because he had also played D&D, anti-game activists held this up as proof that D&D could push disturbed kids over the edge. In reality, Sellers' involvement with hardcore satanic rituals far overshadowed his casual gameplay, but nuance was lost in the rush to condemn RPGs. Sellers later became a born-again Christian on death row and spoke about the evils of occult practice, further fueling the narrative. Amid these stories, some law enforcement agencies actively invited experts like Patricia Pulling to train officers on recognizing occult crime. Police were handed badge literature about D&D and Satanism. This led to comical misunderstandings. For instance, a gaming hobby store owner in the late 80s recalled local cops asking if his D&D group sacrificed babies, having been briefed that the game involved such things. The FBI would eventually debunk the broader Satanic Panic in 1992 report, finding no evidence of organized satanic crime networks. But during the 1980s, even absurd claims were taken seriously. An example from Oregon in 1985, a minister named Reverend John Quigley campaigned against a middle school D&D program, claiming the game was an occult tool that could cause demon possession. He warned that there were already 600 practicing witches in the area, and we don't need any more, arguing D&D was effectively training new ones. Quigley even alleged that allowing D&D in a public school violated the separation of church and state, because in his view, it taught witchcraft, a religion, in the classroom. School officials noted the game was just one of many harmless hobby options alongside chess and model rockets, and students had been playing for years without issue. But to critics like Quigley and Pulling, any evidence of fantasy or occult themes in youth culture was part of a dire pattern. The panic casts a very wide net. D&D, heavy metal, horror movies, even Halloween itself were lumped together as Satan's handiwork. The TSR response, defending D&D and cleaning house, was their only choice. Caught in the crossfire, TSR Inc., the publisher of D&D, struggled to counter the wave of negative press. In the mid-'80s, TSR representatives made efforts to engage with communities, like the meeting in Utah, to explain that D&D was just a game of imagination, not a devil worship cult. The company even hired Dr. Joyce Brothers, a well-known psychologist, to speak publicly in defense of D&D. Dr. Brothers assured parents that playing D&D was not harmful. On the contrary, she emphasized its creative storytelling, where ultimately good was meant to triumph over evil. This framing was intended to show that the game had a moral center and positive values. TSR also printed disclaimers in some products stating that the game was fantasy. For example, the Dungeon Master's Guide reminded readers that the magic spells described were not real incantations, merely part of the play experience. Nevertheless, the company recognized that perceptions mattered. And in 1989, when TSR released the second edition of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, they made significant edits to appease worried parents and religious critics. All references to demons and devils, which had been part of the game's bestiary, were expunged or rewritten. The familiar fiendish monsters remained in the rulebooks, but under sanitized names. Demons became Tanari, and devils became Beitezu? I don't know how to say those. And collectively, they were just called fiends. The D words were never uttered in the new edition's text. TSR hoped that by removing overtly biblical-sounding evil, they might quell the accusations of Satanism. Similarly, the artwork in the late 80s products was toned down. Scantily clad succubi and occult pentagrams disappeared from illustrations. The role of assassin, present as a character class in earlier rules, was phased out, partly to avoid the notion that the game encouraged players to roleplay as contract killers. These changes were a form of self-censorship. TSR was trying to ride out the storm by denying critics easy targets. As one D&D designer later quipped, the demon removal was basically lip service to the complaints. Anyone determined to see evil in the game would just find something else to object to. Indeed, many long-term fans kept calling demons and devils by their old names at home, but TSR's official publications steered clear of the terms for nearly a decade. Despite the controversy, D&D sales continued strong through the 1980s, proof that the game's appeal outlasted the bad press. But the content of the games was unquestionably influenced by the panic. For example, entire adventure modules that dealt heavily with the infernal themes were either scrapped or published with caution. TSR avoided adventures that might be seen as simulating occult rituals. In one famous case, the Deities and Demigods Handbook had included the Cthulhu mythos and other lore. By the time of the second edition, TSR steered away from publishing anything that mixed real-world occult figures with the game. The corporate logic was clear. Why offer your enemies ammunition? By cleaning up D&D's image, at least superficially, TSR aimed to deprive groups like Bad of their talking points. By the end of the 1980s, cracks were forming in the Satanic Panic movement. The broader cultural hysteria, which had also accused daycare operators, heavy metal bands, and other satanic activities, began unraveling as investigations failed to find evidence of the conspiracies claimed. Likewise, the dire warnings about Dungeons & Dragons started to face organized pushback. In 1987, a gamer advocacy network called the Committee for the Advancement of Roleplay Games formed, collecting data to refute the unfounded claims. The most thorough debunking came in 1990, when writer Michael A. Stackpole published the Pulling Report. Stackpole meticulously dismantled Patricia Pulling's assertions, noting errors, misrepresentations, and lack of credentials in Bad's materials. He demonstrated that the suicide rate among gamers was actually lower than the national average, and that Bad's evidence was largely anecdotal or fabricated. The Pulling Report circulated widely, undercutting Bad's credibility at a time when media attention was shifting away. Indeed, after about 1989, the media's fascination with satanic cults and D&D diminished markedly. A 2005 study later noted that after 1992, virtually no new articles or editorials worrying about D&D appeared. Only retrospective pieces looking back on the panic were published in the late 90s. Patricia Pulling herself gradually faded away from prominence. She co-authored a book in 1989 titled The Devil's Web: Who is Stalking Your Children for Satan?, which encapsulated the peak panic mentality. It made no distinction between fantasy games, occult practice, and real crime, essentially suggesting they were all threads of one big satanic plot. But by the point many readers and law enforcement had grown skeptical of such claims, Pulling passed away in 1997 from cancer, and Bad quietly disbanded. Meanwhile, the RPG industry marched on. In 1991, the reputable American Association of Suicidology and CDC both concluded there was no causal link between fantasy role-playing and suicide. The academic and psychiatric consensus emerged that D&D was not inherently harmful. If anything, it was beneficial as a social hobby. The absence of real evidence meant the moral panic had nothing left to sustain it. Parents found new targets in the 90s to worry about. Violent video games like Mortal Kombat and Doom became the fresh boogeymen, replaced D&D in media's crosshairs. As journalist Radley Belko later wrote, the D&D scare in hindsight was a moral panic whose direct consequences, banning the game and ostracizing some kids, were mild compared to other panics, though it had pretty devastating fallout in some cases of the criminal justice system wrongly pursuing Satanism. By the late 1990s, D&D's public image was largely rehabilitated. In 1997, TSR was acquired by Wizards of the Coast, who soon decided to reintroduce the banned terminology. By 1999, products like A Paladin in Hell and Guide to Hell proudly brought back demons and devils alongside their invented names. As gamer designer Monte Cook remarked, removing them had been unnecessary lip service, and now the company felt free to experiment with new kinds of content without fear of controversy. When D&D 3rd edition launched in 2000, it openly included demons, devils, and darker themes, with the understanding that the fervor had died down and the once taboo content no longer ruffled feathers. The satanic panic had finally burned itself out, leaving D&D free to fully be itself again. Today, the Satanic Panic of the 1980s is remembered as a cautionary tale, and within the tabletop RPG community as a bizarre and somewhat absurd chapter of its history. Modern D&D players, including many who were kids or teens during the 80s, often swap war stories of having to hide D&D books from parents or of gaming groups labeled as devil worshippers by ignorant neighbors. What was once a frightening allegation is now an ironic joke. Some communities refer to one's gaming night as doing satanic rituals. Articles frequently revisit the era to analyze how it unfolded. Retrospectives often carry a tone of disbelief that this all happened. It's almost funny in hindsight that so many adults once thought casting Fireball in a game meant a child was on the road to hell. Pop culture has also taken the opportunity to reflect on the mythologized Satanic Panic. A more recent and notable example is the fourth season of Netflix series Stranger Things, which uses the D&D panic as a plot element. In the show, a high school Hellfire Club of D&D players becomes the target of community hysteria when bizarre murders occur. Townspeople, egged on by a fire and brimstone preacher, accuse the D&D club of satanic rituals. The Wall Street Journal, when reviewing Stranger Things, noted that it goes full satanic panic, demonstrating how ingrained this episode is in nostalgia for the 1980s. For many viewers, especially younger ones, it was an eye-opening depiction of just how far the moral panic went, a point reinforced by the show's authentic use of 1980s D&D paraphernalia in satanic panic rhetoric. Within the tabletop RPG community, the legacy of the Satanic Panic has been paradoxical. On one hand, it's a badge of honor. The hobby survived a wild, unjustified witch hunt. The fact that D&D is now more popular than ever with 5th edition breaking sales records and celebrities openly playing is sometimes pointed out with a touch of vindication. The doomsayers were proven utterly wrong. On the other hand, the community remains wary of how easily misinformation can spread. The panic prompted gamers to become ambassadors for the hobby, always ready to explain its true nature to outsiders. The stigma has largely faded, but its shadow lingers in places like prisons, where as late as 2010, a U.S. prison banned D&D as gang activity, a decision upheld in court despite lack of evidence of any harm. The lesson learned is that a hobby can be a scapegoat under the right or wrong conditions, so fans today often emphasize the educational, social, and creative benefits of RPGs to preempt any resurgence of old fears. Looking back, the Satanic Panic appears in hindsight as a moral crusade built on urban legends and anxieties of a changing society. It had all the classic elements of folk panic, concerned parents, unscrupulous experts peddling fear, sensational media coverage, and even political opportunism. For a time, a simple game of fantasy adventure was cast as a literal spiritual battleground for the souls of the young, yet the content of D&D, spells, demons, and all, was ultimately irrelevant to the real causes of teen suicides or violence, which were far more complex. Today's D&D players sometimes incorporate humorous nods to that era in their games. Game designers have even cheekily referenced the panic. For example, one D&D 5th edition adventure is named Baldur's Gate, Descent into Avernus, plunging characters into literal hell. And the indie RPG scene produces a satirical game titled Satanic Panic, where players portray government agents during the 1980s investigating RPG groups. D&D fans turn what was intended as a serious accusation into an in-joke and pop cultural story to retell.
Yep. There you go. I mean, so these type of things, the Satanic Panic, the basically rallying against rock and roll and violent video games and everything, really stem from something that I think is largely disappearing, which I think is great.
Yeah.
And that is that parents in that time period, traditionally parents for a very long time, especially during that 50s to 80s, 90s, they were detached from their kids in a weird way.
Yeah.
Like in the atomic household where the mother was at home taking care of everything, there was kind of a sense of the kids are going to go play their games and I don't need to know what they're doing. And so when something was oh my gosh, this is threatening my kids, they went full bore to protect instead of understanding what was what the kids were into.
Yeah.
And so you end up getting into these situations where the evidence of kids being damaged links up to them seeking methods of self-medication. And so people cause like causality, and they're like, oh, these same kids did these things. We're like, well, yeah, they're doing them because they're seeking methods of ways to fix themselves without them really knowing about it, because you're not doing your job.
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways it's something for them to relate to.
Yeah.
They can't relate to their parents because their parents, not for lack of trying, but their parents aren't there. It's just this, I think at the time period that a lot of those people grew up, the mentality of raising a child was more, it takes a village. So yeah, your kids went out, played with the other kids. They went to school. They came home. Oh, I make sure they've got clothes on their back. I make sure they got food in their bellies, blah, blah, blah. But everything else is, well, that's just a kid growing up. And you had a culture that was changing and the parents weren't paying attention to it. It was a complete lack of any awareness of what was happening around them. And then pile on top of that, just absolute strict religious rule in everyday life, something that has reduced so much over the years that churches are literally closing because they can't get enough people to fill the seats and fill their coffers.
Just, anyway, you can have opinions about parts of that. But yeah, like you're right. It's that thing. It's like you said, it's a boiling of like, as people who grow up and become parents themselves, they'll always have a bias, and they will see their kids as living in the world that they grew up in.
Yeah.
And that's a very dangerous thing to do. And good parents, many, like, basically people that are being parents right now, hopefully many of you, like, you realize that that's not true. And that, like, you can't always predict how to protect your kid, but you can always be empathetic and watch what they're going through. And if you had done that during any of these, you would have just been like, oh, that's dumb. Like, what you're saying does not match what my child does. And like, yeah, and the thing too is, the irony for D&D amongst all these things is that role-playing has been shown to be one of the best outlets for a person to deal with social issues during their development, because they're in an environment where basically they're allowed to fail socially without repercussions. And like, when people started figuring out about this, books and reports and studies and PhDs were formed on this concept. And now it's like deeply integrated in a lot of circles. But back then they were just like, no, you're doing the devil's work.
Yeah. No. And it's just anything they didn't agree with at the time period was just, oh, it's the devil. So yeah, you can't do that.
No.
Like I remember growing up, and a classmate of mine wasn't allowed to have a Nintendo or anything because that was witchcraft to them. TV is one thing, like, that it's being broadcast, but now you're interacting with the TV. That's witchcraft.
You got the devil in you.
Absolutely.
Hey man, go summon demons and all hail our Lord. Just kidding.
Praise Bahamut.
Praise Bahamut. Just make, you got to bring Asmodeus to your heart.
Gotta let him in.
Just let him in deep inside, and just let him
in, let him stir, let him fester.
Yeah, just stir things around a little bit. That's the truth to everlasting peace. Blah, 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 blah. Like, whatever. Like, just so stupid.
And as we always say on our podcast,
all right, I think we're going to end it before we descend into gibbering madness. All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.